This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You
Exactly.
say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I ask a guest to provide context and background to a big story in the news. This week, fake news, extremism and hate speech on the internet. I've been talking to Chloe Colliver at the ISD, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Not just a think tank, a think and do tank as they describe themselves, researching and responding to online extremism in all its forms. As the head of ISD's digital research unit, she takes us through the rapid recent growth of this dangerous phenomenon, and she raises a red flag on the approaching US presidential election. Thanks very much, Chloe Colliver, for joining us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? You're at the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. You guys say that you are looking for extremism, polarization online in whatever form. Give me an idea of the sort of thing that you're looking for. How does that manifest itself in the online world?
We look for quite a broad spectrum of material touching on hate, extremism, and even in some instances, violent extremism and terrorism on the internet. So at one end of that spectrum is the most egregious and nastiest kind of content you might expect to see online. So that is relating to terrorist organizations like ISIS or violent white supremacist groups. But the majority of what we see and what we look for is slightly subtler. It's hate speech or recruitment materials for organizations or movements that are seeking to attack minority communities, that are trying to mobilize hate or violence on and offline, or that are using false information to try and radicalize and recruit people using all sorts of different internet platforms.
And has that been growing over the last couple of years?
Yes, we've seen the internet sort of hypercharge offline efforts to spread hate and division. So it's enabled all sorts of people entry into these kind of groups and movements that previously probably wouldn't have come across them. It's kind of a new public sphere that's enabled lots of different kinds of hate and disinformation to proliferate. And we've seen those kind of tactics adopted much more broadly than we did a few years ago. Everyone obviously remembers the 2016 American election, which saw the Russian state using disinformation as a tool of its information warfare. But what we've seen is all sorts of political, domestic and international groups kind of pick up this toolkit online with a very low cost for entry and start to use it for their own ends, whether that's political, commercial, or a mixture of the two.
That's interesting when you say it can have a very low cost for entry, because, I mean, we'll come back to talk about this, but we think about state actors, for instance. But from what you're saying, you don't need to be a big government, a big corporation. You don't need to have a lot of money to get into this. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Both the massive benefit and the danger of social media platforms is that they are extremely accessible, free to use, and very, very easy to access at scale. That's obviously a reason why they're so wonderful for communications technology around the world, but it's also an inherent risk in terms of how they can be abused and manipulated very easily without much money or resource required. So we see huge PR companies that pick up these kind of tools and tactics, either for their own commercial purposes or as kind of almost like guns for hire on the internet for foreign states, for political groups, for private companies or interests, whatever it might be. So there's an entire industry really set up for this, but equally, you could do it from your back bedroom if you were really committed and you had an agenda that you wanted to fulfill using these kind of internet platforms. So it's a constant battle for these companies to try and raise the barrier for entry to disinformation or hate activity on their platforms.
I mean, give me an idea of the way you pursue what you do. I mean, is it just an awful lot of sitting in front of a screen and just monitoring endless amounts of material? I imagine maybe it's a bit more focused than that. How do you go about doing it?
So a few years ago, when studying extremists or disinformation on the internet was quite a new phenomenon, there was a lot of manual analysis, really having to dig around different platforms and find out how different groups were starting to use them. But over the last few years, our team has developed quite a different kind of capability for doing this work. It's a mixture of some human analysis, so some of that manual digging, getting into groups that are otherwise closed to researchers to make sure that we're covering spots that might be blind spots for threats or hate mobilization. But also some of our team has very strong kind of data science capability. So some of these platforms have so much data that we have to use kind of social science and data science techniques to understand trends in information, to be able to spot anomalies or signals of deceptive or distortive behavior, and to try and figure out what's going on at scale in terms of hate or disinformation activity. So we've done a lot of work on trying to figure out ways to speed up that process and enable us to find some of the bigger networks or activities that are going on rather than just manually trawling around to try and find the worst of it.
Can you give me an example of where that system might have worked, where you've been able to pick up on something and say, aha, I think this is something we need to be having a good look at?
So earlier this year, we were very focused on looking at disinformation around COVID-19. And something that we were able to use our tools to help us spot was a really significant network of thousands of Twitter accounts that we saw suddenly created in March 2020 and all promoting Chinese Communist Party's propaganda around COVID-19 to English-speaking audiences. And what we were able to do was to use a number of signals, I suppose, of strange activity that we had seen in this network of accounts to try and build a more concrete picture of whether this might be a coordinated network, whether it was managed by either a single actor or a company or a government, and then to try and assess sort of the scale and activities of that network. And that resulted in a report that we wrote about this network and a massive takedown by Twitter of quite a few of those accounts that we had seen deceptively posing as English-speaking users, but actually just spamming pro-Chinese Communist Party propaganda around COVID-19 on the platform.
So what sort of things were they saying in these spam messages on this great scale?
There was a lot of disinformation around COVID-19 being a bioweapon created by the US, a lot of kind of geopolitical narratives promoting the Chinese response to COVID versus those of other countries around the world, as well as quite a lot of commentary on issues around Taiwan and more regional political battles that were ongoing at the time. So this network was being used for a number of different geopolitical purposes. We didn't necessarily see much impact from it. Often these kind of networks, because as we've discussed, they're so easy to set up and there's not much cost to it. They're set up and it's kind of throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach. And sometimes they're not particularly effective as far as we can tell. But that kind of understanding the impact of them is very difficult. Their approach isn't necessarily to change attitudes and behavior. It might just be to sow distrust in information and the information that people are receiving online, for example.
But this was a big effort by the Chinese government, right?
Definitely couldn't tell whether it was from the Chinese government directly. It was from some set of actors or an actor that was clearly had an agenda to support the narratives of the Chinese Communist Party. But that level of attribution of the whodunit is extremely difficult for researchers. We don't have enough access to data. It's really easy to fake your identity online and to pretend you're someone else. So it's really only the social media platforms themselves that have access to enough data to really start to do that level of attribution. So we're still a little bit in the dark around how we can start to understand exactly who is behind some of these operations.
Is that an area where you need more help, where you need more resources? And do you think with a little bit more backing, you could start to say, actually, right, we name the guilty people?
Absolutely. Something we've been calling for some time now is greater data access for researchers from these kind of companies so that there's some independent ability to do this work and to find out what's going on behind the scenes. At the moment, apart from Twitter, which is a very open platform and provides you with a lot of information about what's going on, most of the other major social media companies remain very closed off to the public and to researchers. It's extremely difficult for us to do research and to tell what's going on and to tell the public what's going on. And we've been asking the companies themselves to try and improve that, but also increasingly democratic governments who really could step up to the plate and start to regulate this sector in the way that they regulate other kind of corporate sectors as well. At the moment, it's still a little bit of a wild west, and these companies get a pretty free ride in terms of their activities, their processes, the risks that they pose to users and to wider society. And we've started to see governments, including the UK government, take a bit of a stand and say, hold up, there needs to be some kind of responsible framework here for your actions and your processes as companies, including more transparency so people can understand what you're doing and what's going on.
So a little start, but obviously not enough yet, and you want them to go further, both pressure from the governments and the big companies like Facebook, I presume.
So there's definitely been improvements made by the companies over the last 4 years to try to provide a bit more information on what they're doing internally to deal with problems like disinformation or fake accounts. But it's still pretty much just in the control of the companies themselves, what they say, what they release, what they let people know about these kind of issues. Governments have started to have these conversations. There's actually the drafting of a bill in the UK that's precisely relevant to this set of issues at the moment, that's due in October. But again, we're seeing kind of slight delays in really pushing that over the line to make it effective in terms of being able to deal with these problems.
I suppose the companies would say, look, our clients are entitled to privacy. We can't just be opening up all their accounts to people having a good dig around. They've got a point, haven't they?
Absolutely. But there are a lot of privacy protecting ways of sharing data with researchers that have been used in all sorts of other sectors of work, whether we're talking about health data or financial data. And GDPR, as it still partially exists in the UK, but definitely still exists in European law, is also a massive protection for that kind of personal data. So, there wouldn't be any way of sharing that publicly or with researchers that would contravene those kind of protections. So there are a few ways you could do that. You could share it directly with the public or researchers when it's been anonymized or destructured. But you could also have a regulator who has the right to go in and audit those kind of systems and to understand, privately behind the scenes what's going on at these companies in the way that financial services, for example, have their algorithms or their systems regulated and audited by an independent expert body.
Okay, let's talk about the US and the US election coming up, not far away. Have you been looking at that quite a lot?
We have indeed. It's been keeping us pretty busy this year, given the scale of disinformation and hate that's been proliferating on the platforms. There's an enormous amount of disinformation about COVID-19 in the US. There's an enormous amount of disinformation about the voting process and the election itself, and also about the protests and civil rights debates that have been underway around Black Lives Matter and racial justice this year as well. So a lot of key points around which disinformation and hate have been mobilized online.
Who's it coming from? I mean, it sounds as if it's all coming from roughly the same place, if I can put it like that, ideologically, the far right. Is that fair, or is that just the impression we get?
It's definitely fair to say most of the evidence that has been found to date suggests that the far right, a number of pro-Trump movements included within that far right milieu, are the most active in using some of these tactics and tools to spread false information, lies, or hate online. It's definitely not the only set of actors, though, and our work is trying to uncover anyone who's using this kind of approach to deceive citizens around the election. So we've seen some quite deceptive tactics from progressive left groups who are advertising using shell companies or trying to hide their identities to promote political advertising online, for example. And we have still seen foreign states like China, like Iran, Russia, quite overtly propagandizing around the US election, even without necessarily having to cover up their tracks. So there's a pretty broad spectrum of actors that are getting involved. But as you say, we've seen an enormous amount of disinformation coming out of the far right in the US and globally directed at the US as well.
Can you give me just one of the most glaring examples of that that's come across your radar?
I think the most concerning issue area that we've seen a constant disinformation attack on is around vote by mail. Obviously, during the pandemic, there's a massive reliance on mail-in voting in the US this year for the election, and it changes the way that most citizens are going to be voting. Right from the White House administration through to kind of nebulous online networks of the conservative right and also the far right and extreme right, we've seen a really long-running disinformation campaign trying to claim that mail-in ballots and vote by mail is fraudulent, that it will mean that the election result won't be reliable or credible, and completely exaggerating or falsifying the facts about the process of voting by mail. And that's been a really long-running disinformation campaign that's basically effectively coming out of the mouthpiece of the White House, as well as from a number of different kinds of actors on the right. And it's really concerning the kind of embedded nature of that disinformation campaign in the conversation around the vote this year. So that's probably the biggest one we've seen. But you get all sorts of kind of strange and wacky kinds of disinformation at a smaller scale as well. There's currently a disinformation campaign going on to claim that George Soros, the philanthropist and billionaire, is hiring U-Haul vans to kind of get people to protests around the US, for example. So you see kind of a mixture of the very big and the very long term, as well as kind of sporadic, quite small scale, but quite targeted disinformation attacks as well.
Now, you mentioned President Trump. Now, President Trump is overt when he says, look, I'm worried about the mail-in ballots, and I think this is a problem. But it sounds like there are people who pick that up, you would say, in a more covert way, and in a sense spread his message for him. But I guess it's completely independent of what's going on in the White House, even though the White House is quite happy in a way to have their message go out. Is that a fair representation?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no necessary sense that this is a coordinated attempt to get all of these different voices singing from the same hymn sheet. But it's very easy for all sorts of actors to pick up that kind of dog whistle from the White House and to go off and promote their own disinformation around that issue area, whether it's on YouTube videos, through Facebook ads, or on Twitter or Telegram or Reddit or whatever site they might want to use to get to different communities. The covert side of this is the bit that's really hard to uncover. And there's still kind of very little research out there that's able to ascertain when there's massive covert attempts to spread disinformation on different platforms, partly, as we talked about, because of the data access issues, but also that this is a really new sector of work. There aren't that many organizations able to look at this, given the scale of the problem. So it's a little bit of a kind of tidal wave of disinformation and covert activity against quite a small independent research sector trying to figure out what's going on.
Now, we talk about the US. What about the UK? I mean, there was obviously a certain amount of discussion about what happened in 2016 with the European referendum. But what about, we had an election last year. Is there anything that you have been looking at that you think we should be talking about?
We did do some work around the UK election in 2019, trying to spot kind of deceptive or distortive activity online. One of the key things that we came out of that election thinking was that these sorts of tools and tactics have really been mainstreamed, even to the extent of them being used by political parties themselves. I think, a lot of listeners will remember one of the Conservative Party's Twitter handles getting renamed during a debate to pretend to be a fact-checking organization. That's a form of disinformation in itself. That's kind of false identity from a political party. That's a disinformation tactic in the hands of a ruling political party. We also saw an enormous amount of attempts to kind of drive wedge issues and disinformation at minority communities in the UK. So we actually saw quite a lot of activity from Hindu nationalists in both India and the UK targeting anti-Muslim narratives at Labour supporters in particular. So there were lots of kind of sneaky ways of different groups trying to use online platforms to either progress their own agenda, to spread false information, or to deceive voters in various ways. So it was quite a broad spectrum of actors picking up these kind of tactics and tools. There were a lot of different political and policy narratives that were under attack from disinformation. And overall, the Electoral Commission, who would like, I think, to have more powers to be able to analyse and to respond to those kind of deceptive tactics, were left pretty much in the lurch. They haven't been granted the powers to really look at the online space in the way that that they would like to by Parliament. And so we don't really have a sense of the rules of the road in online campaigning still. All of this stuff is in the grey zone of licit or illicit. And even if it gets called out, there's not necessarily any sanction or any punishment for those who are using those kind of tools and tactics to try to get their way during the election campaign.
What would you say to those people who would say, look, this is about free speech. It's the internet. This is where, people can say things, people can say stuff back to them. And people like yourselves, in a way, are just reinforcing a kind of establishment view of what is allowed to be said, if you like. And the online world should be for people to get out there and express opinions that don't necessarily fit in with what's the consensus view. What would you say to that?
So a couple of thoughts on that point. The first is that this idea of a binary between free speech and censorship is not really accurate in terms of disinformation online. That relies on thinking that disinformation is just false content. It's the actual lies, it's the fake news. That's actually just, as we discussed, quite a small piece of the picture in terms of disinformation. A lot of this is false identities, infiltrating communities with false identities, false networks of actors. It's kind of deceptive behaviors instead of just content. And you don't have a right to pretend to be someone else on the internet. That kind of behavior side of things, I think, gets us away from thinking about what's right information and what's wrong information. And actually, those kind of tactics and behaviors are really detrimental to our kind of democratic fabric. And that's an area that we can move on and we can try and improve on without even thinking about what's correct and what's false or what's right and what's wrong. So that's one bucket that I think doesn't even touch on the kind of speech debate and argument. The other is that these platforms themselves should be as much of a haven for free speech as we can make them. But the platforms are built around business models that make decisions about what kind of speech they think should be preferenced over others. And at the moment, that's based on what sells the most advertising. So what gets the most eyeballs. They are making decisions themselves about what should be promoted, demoted, kept up, removed. There's no oversight, no democratic or transparent oversight around why and how they're making those decisions. I think what we need to do is actually try and re-level the playing field for free speech so that it's not the most outrageous or sensationalist content on whatever end of the political spectrum that is getting amplified, targeted and promoted to make money for these platforms, but actually that we can understand a bit more about how they're choosing what information everyone sees so that it's a bit more even for everyone to get their voice heard and that the rules are clearer, the enforcement's clearer, and everyone understands kind of the rules of the road and the game on these platforms. And we can have a much more safe space for wide democratic debate rather than relying on private companies to make those decisions for us.
If you find this material, and you obviously do, and you point it out, I mean, is all you can do point it out and try and just publicize it? Can you take it to, I don't know, the government department? I don't know whether it's a culture, media and sport or whoever will be responsible. What can you do once you've found it?
It really depends on the kind of information or activity that we're seeing. Obviously, if there's a threat from a foreign agent or if there's a threat to life or public safety, that kind of thing gets reported to the relevant agency or regulator or whatever it might be in the UK, the US or globally. But a lot of this stuff, if you report it to a company to try and get it investigated or removed, you'll sometimes get a response. You sometimes won't get a response. Often if you threaten that you're going to media and doing a piece of journalistic work on that piece of content or activity, you'll get a much quicker response. But you can also work with civil society. So we do a lot of work with people who are being targeted or are witnessing this kind of a disinformation attack or harassment and hate attacks on their communities. They're really important to be talking to about this because they're the ones who are actually being affected and impacted by a lot of that kind of content. So we do a lot of work with them to inform them about the threats we're seeing, how they might be able to better respond or equip their communities to not believe or be tricked into the kind of narratives and false information that we're seeing proliferate that might be targeting them. So there's also that kind of resilience building and education side of things that needs to happen because sadly, you're never going to get rid of all hate speech. You're never going to get rid of all false information and lies or deceptive activity on these platforms. So we do also need to do a big effort in terms of building resilience and resistance to that kind of stuff among citizens themselves so that they have not only their rights online, but also the responsibilities of being responsible citizens on the internet and being able to spot this stuff themselves and know how to deal with it.
Which I think leads me on to my last question, really, which is, if you're a citizen sitting at home on your phone, on your laptop, whatever it is, what should you be looking out for? What should be ringing the alarm bells if you think, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that, and you would be concerned that there's more to it? What should people look out for?
So there's some really good resources that can point people towards the kind of checks or questions they should be asking regularly when they're looking at stuff online. So organizations like Full Fact, which is a fact-checking organization in the UK, have really simple suggestions of things like, what does this piece of information make you feel? Do you know where it's come from? And do you know why you're seeing it? Because those kind of simple questions can just get you to think for a few more seconds about critically about why you're seeing something and whether there might be some issues with where that's come from and what the agenda is behind you seeing it. So really simple kind of critical thinking checks, I think, are going to be the bastion of our response to this from society. And double checking, the sources, making sure you're verifying that things aren't being shared from dubious websites or from pages that don't exist, for example, just to try and make sure that people are getting the best information they can and they're doing their homework on where that's coming from and why.
Chloe Colliver, thank you very, very much. Very, very interesting and very useful guide to how we can be more aware of what we see in the online world all around us. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Thanks, Andy.
Chloe Colliver from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review and share this podcast. If you have thoughts on this or have ideas for other podcasts, please email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk. I'm tweeting it at AndyBell5News. I hope you enjoyed this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.